There we go. All right. We decided, after some prayer and contemplation, decided that our next study would be on the Gospel of John. And John is an absolutely wonderful gospel. There is just a ton of material in there. A ton of just, I like to call it good meaty material, for lack of a better phrase. And it may take us quite some time to get through this. It depends on how fine of a brush we paint with, because some of this stuff you can paint with a really fine brush, as you will see by today. So we may get partway through it, take a break, we may continue on. We'll just kind of see what everybody's attention span and everything like that is. So, yeah, Aaron? Okay, I put it low to see if I could get rid of the plosives there and see if that okay. So, before we get into John, I thought it would be interesting. What I think is interesting, whatever the people think is interesting is not always the same. But I thought it'd be interesting to hit a very fast overview. Yeah, I'm not going to give it to you yet. Of the four Gospels. So, let's ask some fun questions. Which Gospel was written first? Mark is correct. Or widely assumed that it is Mark. Okay, we don't know specifically, though all the evidence points that Mark was the first written. What is the second written? Matthew. Number 3 is Luke. And number 4 is John. Now I'll let you have the sheets. Oh, my time's passed. I can't pass out the sheets anymore. And originally they actually did think it was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which is why that became the canonical order. But as they have studied it more, they've determined that Mark was actually probably Mark was the first one written, because Matthew actually uses a fair amount of Mark. Now Mark, and nobody knows who Mark was. Okay, church tradition says that the best explanation is that Mark is John Mark, that we see also in the Bible, and that what occurs here in Mark is that this is Peter's memoirs, shortly before he's executed. There is, you can go in, you can look at Mark, and I don't know Greek, okay, but they say Mark appears to be very hastily written. The Greek in it is sloppy, they tell us. As I said, I don't know these things. And the best answer I've heard on Mark is that this is Peter close to his execution, and the church and everybody is saying, okay, we need to get some of this written down. Matthew is next. Matthew addresses a Jewish audience. And you can see that by the way Matthew starts. How does Matthew start? He starts with the genealogy showing that Christ is from David and from Abraham. Why is that important? Prophecy. Continue on more. Why is that important? Because the Messiah is supposed to come from the house of David. That's part of the Davidic covenant. There we go. Mark, as I said, Mark was written first. That could be AD 50 to 55, as late as 70. Matthew is written second to a Jewish audience to prove that Jesus is the Messiah. He starts with the genealogy. Dates are probably around 55 AD, but prior to 70 AD, he does plagiarize Mark, or borrow significant portions of Mark, including misspellings and poor syntax in the places that he borrows from. And that's why they know that he borrowed from Mark, is because he didn't correct some of the mistakes that are in it. Luke is written next. Now, Luke is an interesting one to me. Haven't gotten all the way through Luke. We started that back when we were at Grace and Mercy. And if you look at the prologue to Luke, it says, my dear Theophilus, I am writing this to you to confirm, what you have been taught. Theophilus is a Greek name. And so you think of Luke more in terms of a persuasive essay than in terms of a biography. And that really kind of helps explain how Luke approaches his writing. And I won't go into that today. Luke is probably written around 55, but prior to 70 AD, there's a little bit of Mark that ends up in that. Okay, trivia question. What happens in 70 AD that is significant?
Temple.
The destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. That is correct. And that's why we say that all of these are done before 70 AD, because there's nothing in the synoptic gospels that talks about the destruction of the temple. They all predict it as a future event. So now we get down to John. And a little bit of background on John. The dates could be 80 to 100 AD. We don't really know exactly when that is, but it is definitely one of the last Gospels written. In about 94 AD, John is exiled to Patmos by the evil Emperor Domitian. We believe that he is probably returned to Ephesus in 96. And so they place the writing of the Gospel of John somewhere between 90 and 100 AD, written in Ephesus by John. And we also know John is the writer of 1st and 2nd John and also the book of Revelation, which is what he received in Patmos. Now, there are a few people who believe that John may not have written Revelation because the style of Greek is significantly different between the gospel and the Revelation, which is maybe accounted for is that maybe he didn't write it, maybe he dictated it. So there's some iffiness that goes into all this, of course, because we don't have this. But coming back to the dates of 80 to 100 AD, Christianity has spread, and it has spread all across the Roman world at this point in time. And the majority of the church is Gentile, not Jewish anymore. And so we have this melding that has gone on. And part of that melding is, what is this new teaching? What is Christianity? And Paul deals with that to a certain degree, because there were people that Paul addressed, in particularly the letter to Galatians, where they said you have to obey the law to be a Christian. And Paul addresses that in the letter to Galatians. So there's a lot of there's a lot of heretical teachings that have come out during the time from when Christ has died until where we are today, as they try to explore and they try to figure out who Jesus is and how he relates to not only Judaism, but how the Greeks keep trying to put their own spin on things too. And one of those spins that the Greeks have tried to put on this is Gnosticism. And we don't see John address Gnosticism completely, but we see him address it, somewhat indirectly. And Gnosticism, in short, from what I understand, says that everything that is physical, everything that is matter, is bad, it's evil. And everything that is spirit is good. And one of the things that the Gnostics would say is that Jesus either can't be deity, because that means that you would have matter and spirit together, or he can't be human, and he only appears to be human, in which case, you don't have the matter and the spirit together. And you will see John address that in his first chapter. So that's kind of a little bit of background on it. And as you look at, John is one of the few Gospels, John's the only Gospel, that has a complete theology in it. if you start with Mark and you look at Mark's writings are pretty much just this happened, this was said, this happened, this happened. Matthew expands a little bit, Luke expands more, and when you get to John, you actually have a full-blown theology that comes out. Now, there are some that say that John may have actually been written by a committee, and that what they were trying to do was create essentially a textbook to combat all the different forms and the different schools of thought that are going on. We will see this appear a little bit later on in the book of John. There are places where the people who put Jesus' words in red may have some problems, because you look at it and you say, those words should probably be pink, not red. It may have been what Jesus was communicating, but not necessarily what he said. We'll see that come up. But you also have to remember that John's writing this 70 years after the event. You know, I can't think of anything that happened to me 70 years ago. Okay, that's a joke because I'm not 70 yet. Okay, but I mean, even if you take like the early gospel numbers, the early writers of like 50 or 55 AD, think about the fact that's 25 years ago. You know, how can you think of an event in your life 25 years ago that you could actually significantly remember enough to write all the details about? I don't know. I'm not sure I have anything like that. I'm not sure my memory's that good. Now, granted, this is a substantial memory that, walking around with Jesus, that would have really stuck in your brain. But even then, time colors our perception. And it colors our memory. That was an aside, sorry. I've looked at, is it possible that John was influenced by the current theologians? And I've asked this question before. Not, somebody else, a friend of mine, that he was doing a study of John. And I said, okay, was John influenced by, like, Paul? Because Paul would have been a contemporary of him at the time. We can't prove or disprove that theory. We don't see John coming up with the concept. Paul was really huge on salvation by grace. And we see that all the way through Paul's letters. Okay, salvation by grace through faith. We don't see that so much in John, so maybe he wasn't influenced by it. I don't really know. But that's kind of an overview on it, that John's looking at this scenario, and he's looking at the things that are going on in Christianity, and he says, you know what, we need to set this record straight. And he's not setting out to do a biography as in Thursday the 14th, Jesus went down to the pool. That's not what he's intending to do here. He's actually writing in some ways he's writing a textbook on theology about Jesus. And as I said, we see the evolution of what the early church, how they deal with Christology. And we talked about Christology for 4 weeks. The Old Testament does a really great job of saying about the Messiah, talking about the Anointed One, and talking about who's coming, but the Old Testament doesn't spend a whole lot of time talking about how Jesus and God relate to each other. And it's the New Testament where we actually get the concept that the two are one. And so the early church is struggling with this. And that's where John comes in, and that's why he says we need to set the record straight. That's my theory. Sorry. And we have the Gospel of John, which is absolutely wonderful. There's some fantastic teachings in the Gospel of John. Everybody knows, of course, John 3:16. There's other wonderful passages in John. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I go to my Father's house, and there are many mansions. I leave to build you one. Dwelling places. There's some wonderful stuff in John, and we're going to have a great time with it. Okay, now we finally get down to reading a little bit of the Gospel of John. And as you can see, this moves. Today we're going to be moving really slow because we got some things we want to cover in this. Sometimes we will paint a very fine brush. John 1, starting in 5, verse 1, 2, 5, excuse me. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. All things were created through him, and apart from him, not one thing was created that has been created. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. That light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. And we like those, but let's talk first of all about this word that he uses in this particular passage, because John grabs a thought from the Greek world and he grabs a thought from the Jewish world that means something that is very similar, and he puts them together in an absolutely wonderful, well-worded phrase. And the word is logos, which literally means the word. But the Greeks had this, the Greeks loved to think, they loved to philosophize, they loved to figure out why the world is how it is. And the Greeks had a philosophy, a belief, that there was a force out there that kept the world in order. Okay, there is order to the world, right? The sun comes up at the same time, the planets follow their path, the seasons continue. There is order to the world. Things happen in a very predictable, well, at least in terms of nature, very predictable way of doing things. Our lives aren't predictable, but a very predictable way of doing things. And the Greeks said there must be something out there that creates this predictability, because otherwise the world would delve into complete chaos. What they called that was logos. It is what held everything together and held everything in order. To continue, they also believe that logos gave you and people the power to reason and the power to think. So basically what they have done is they have identified one of the attributes of God, eminence, and they have applied it to their own thought world. They've given it a name. They're not calling this God, they're seeing the attribute of God, and they are saying, this, we're going to call it this. Okay? That's the Greek school of thought. Now, the concept in the Jewish world of word is not unique to anything that John is writing. This starts all the way back in Genesis when God said, "Let there be." Fill in the blank. It goes on for several different, it goes on for 6 days. The concept for the Jews is that the power of the Word, or the power of the Word of God, is, there, it's present. They understand the power of the Word of God, or the power of the Word. And so John takes these two concepts, the Greek concept, and it's kind of like what Paul said when he was in Athens. You remember the pitch in Athens that Paul did in Acts? He said he found the altar that says, "To the God who do not know." And he says, "Let me tell you about this God you do not know." And that's kind of what John's doing here. He's saying, okay, you understand this. Let me tell you about who this is. And that's the approach that John is taking when he does these first 5 verses. All right, John makes 6, and you see them. I gave them to you on your paper so you wouldn't have to write them down. John makes 6 very important statements about the Word as we start this chapter. Remember a little bit about the background of the fact that we have heretical teachings going on in terms of who Jesus is and in terms of how Jesus and God relate. In the beginning was the Word. Jesus was around before things existed. Okay, we just take that one. We know that one. We've been taught that one. We're nailing down some things here, okay? We're making some points that have been disputed and debated for the last, 70 years. Jesus was around before things existed. He's not a created being. We get into that one in a minute too. Jesus was with God. That's an important one. Remember, we talked about modality when we were talking about the Trinity, and about how one of the theories of the Trinity was it was always God, but God was revealing himself in different forms. He was God, and then he took on a human body and revealed himself as Jesus, and he goes back up to heaven and he's God, and now he comes down and he reveals himself to the Spirit. It's all God, he's just putting on 3 different outfits, okay? Called modality. That's what he is saying right there is no, it is a distinct and it is a separate person or personality. 3, Jesus is God, equal with God. And John spends a lot of time, or spends more time on that as we go into the rest of the book. I and the Father are one. That's in John. John 8, I love that one. John 8, I existed before Abraham. And he says, I am. Okay? Huge statement in John 8. Okay? And so we see John backing this up, that Jesus is God. He's separate from God, but he is God. We talked about that 2 weeks ago, or not, it was more than 2 weeks, when we talked about the doctrine of the Trinity. Number 4, Jesus created all things. He even repeats that statement. Verse 3, all things were created through him. And the emphasis, and apart from him, not one thing that was created has been created. And so he is showing, one, that he is equal to God, but he is also showing that Jesus is not a created being. That's the other thing that we're coming out of this one, is that Jesus is not like an angel, not like a human, not like a horse. He exists with God. He is not created by God. Number 5, Jesus is life. Verse 4, in him was life. Life was the light of men. The source of life, both physical and spiritual. So we've got this, we've got Jesus, and he is the source of life. He is the reason we have life, both in our spiritual and our physical realm. And then we have, verse 5, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. In the Eastern school of thought, saying that Jesus is light, in the Eastern school of thought, much more than in our Western civilization, there is the concept of kingdoms that we do not see warring against each other. That the world is filled with darkness, and you hear people use that phrase. Sometimes they'll say, this place is very dark, and that thinking is more prevalent when you get off into the Eastern cultures than it is around here. We're more scientific, or I don't know what we are, but analytical. What was the last one, Gordon?
We're great again.
Yeah. And so what John is saying here is that Jesus is, or the Logos, he'll attach Logos to Jesus a little farther down in the chapter. But back to where we were, the concept that is frequent in the Eastern school of thought is that evil is dark, and we still continue with that today, and that goodness is light. And they continue a little bit more and say that, the whole world is full of evil and dark things, like, we're driving down the road and they're trying to sell us little flowers that you could hang around your rear view and scare the spirits off out of your car. So there's definitely much more school of thought in that. And so we see that the concept, and we'll see that all the way through John, and we actually see it really through the whole Bible too, that the concept of light is good and the darkness is evil. And so we see that Jesus is the light. That light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Another important phrase, that the darkness is not overcome by the light. And we look at this today because we were, in Sunday school and, lots of Bible studies and stuff like that. And we accept this as like, okay, Jan, that's pretty good. I know all this. This is written because there was a lot of misinformation that was going on around then. But this also is substantial for us to be able to look back and say, this is why we believe what we believe. And you hear me say that all the time. Know why you believe what you believe, because there will be people who will challenge you. There will be people who will come up and knock on your door and say, I have this Watchtower magazine that I'm going to give to you, and I have a verse to share with you, and they hold a different view of how God and Jesus are related. Know why you believe what you believe. Not just because I said it, but where it is in the Bible and stuff. So that's, as I said, that's kind of we start with a very fine brush as we get going, but that's because there's a lot of material for this particular passage. And we get to even, I don't know, this may take us a while to get through a lot of John, but that's all right. We got good lunches. What's it?